I would like to welcome everyone again to Reunited in Pride, Southeast Kansas Pride 2022. Southeast Kansas Pride is sponsored by Project Q&A, and Project Q&A is a leading nonprofit organization working to educate, empower, and raise visibility for the over 2.9 million LGBTQIA+ individuals who call rural America home. Thank you for tuning in on your lunch for our final Lunch and Learn workshop. Today, we have author W.D. Cullum discussing the power of story. Southeast Kansas-born author W.D. Cullum has been an avid reader, storyteller, and lover of all things language and literature since youth. In the 6th grade, he was featured on the front page of his hometown newspaper, the Independence Daily Reporter, for launching a used book drive for local children in need of the gift of story during the holiday season. Finding himself at the intersection of neurodivergence and queerness, he says, "Narrative was my sanctuary. In youth, the place I found myself safe. In stories, I could find myself at home. I could step inside the world of a story and not have to worry about ways I stuck out. A book is a place to belong." Please welcome W.D. Cullum.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for that gracious welcome. Good afternoon. I am author W.D. Cullum. Outside of my writing and artistic career, most know me as Cody MacRae Cullum. I just wanted to clarify that both identities are entirely me for those who are unaware. I have been a lifelong resident of my hometown of Independence, Kansas, and I studied at Union College in Lincoln, Nebraska. While in college, I studied language arts education, Spanish language studies, English writing and speaking, and I worked on a personalized degree called communication and culture. I set out on that path to become a high school Spanish and language arts instructor, and along the way, I decided to focus more on post-secondary education, specifically language arts and foreign language studies. So I plan to continue my education as a professor in training. I've written a children's book, which I hope to release soon, called Do Ninjas Get Brain Freezes? This children's book follows the quest of Boy Ninja and his nanny ninja as they attempt to answer the titular question. The book seeks to empower agency in children to feel safe, being curious, and asking questions. But it's also very fun and silly. This children's book is a work of narrative poetry and has a very Seussical approach to meter and rhyme scheme, so it's a very much a great deal of fun to read. I'm currently working with a complete typescript, and I'm in storyboarding phases with my illustrator, artist Romualdo de la Cruz, who's also my dad. I'm also working on my debut novel, Believe and Tremble, the first installment in a trilogy I'm calling The Saints of Rickman High. These supernatural queer teenage romance novels take place about 17 years into the future in the fictional town of Rickman, Kansas. When I was studying at Union College, I had a professor named Mike Menard, who taught a class on ancient Western literature. During one of our course lectures, he gave a brief talk on the significance of narrative. And he said something that really impacted me personally. He said, when we talk to each other, we talk in stories. We generally don't speak in algebraic equations. And if you do, that's kind of creepy. All quips aside, that concept truly struck me in a way I hadn't thought of before. This idea that story is integral to our communication as a species, and by extension to our cognitive function, gave me pause. It truly got my mental gears turning. I started to think more deeply and more often about the power held by authors and other storytellers. I have for most of my life held the firm conviction that storytelling and the writing of narrative is a wholly human, deeply sacred and transcendent art form. I believe that when an individual takes up the mantle of a storyteller or a writer of story, they hold power unlike any other vocation. And as Marvel reminds us in the Spider-Man narratives, with great power comes great responsibility. In other words, to whom much is given, much is expected. And as an author myself, I hold the belief that with any story I come up with and endeavor to share with others, I hold that responsibility to make it the best story I possibly can. A few years ago, I was browsing Tumblr posts about Good Omens, one of my favorite television series, which is based upon a book of the same title. Good Omens was a collaborative work between Sir Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. Among the various posts about the characters, plot lines, and inside jokes amongst the fandom of this masterful work of fiction, I found a brief post Neil Gaiman had written about his cousin Helen Fagin, who had survived the Warsaw Ghetto during the Holocaust. She, along with many of the other young Jewish women at the time in the ghettos of Poland, were forced to work as seamstresses to support the war effort of the Third Reich. And reading any written material that had been forbidden by the Nazi Party meant individuals could be sentenced to hard labor or even death. Helen Fagan took it upon herself to operate a clandestine school, as she called it, wherein she would educate the girls in her sewing groups. In Helen's words, she soon came to feel that teaching these sensitive young souls Latin and mathematics was cheating them of something far more essential. What they needed wasn't dry information, but hope, the kind that comes from being transported into a dream world of possibility. There was an underground effort in the Warsaw Ghetto to smuggle in books and circulate them amongst those who could be trusted with them. And cleverly enough, each book was only allowed to be kept by each person for one night, then sent on to a new reader the next day in order to elude interception. Helen spent the hours one night from dusk until dawn reading Margaret Mitchell's novel Gone with the Wind. So the next day, when one of the girls asked her if she could, as she said, tell them a book, it was still quite fresh in Helen's mind. So she told them the story of Gone with the Wind while they sewed. To quote the Neil Gaiman post that originally caught my attention, these girls were risking certain death for a story. And when she told me that story herself, it actually made me feel that what I do is important, more important. Because giving people stories is not a luxury. It's actually one of the things that you live and die for. In a letter relating this story, Helen Fagan writes, "There are times when dreams sustain us more than facts. To read a book and surrender to a story is to keep our very humanity alive." It's a rather extreme example, I'll admit. However, it illustrates that even at the darkest, bleakest, most horrific of times, a story can have that power to breathe life into a person, and even if but for a fleeting moment, allow the mind a place of sanctuary and refuge. Let's take a moment to talk more about the concept of narrative as a sanctuary. Sanctuary has many layers of emotional connotation for many people. For me personally, though, at the heart of the concept of sanctuary is this idea of a safe space, a place where someone can just be, just exist, unbothered, unharmed, and find peace. I myself have always been a bit of an odd duck. I find myself at the intersection of neurodivergence and queerness. When I was a teenager, I was diagnosed with what at the time was regarded as Asperger's syndrome, which has, as of the latest Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, the DSM-5, has been sort of absorbed into the overarching diagnosis of the autism spectrum. I was also diagnosed with bipolar disorder and anxiety. In terms of my queer identity, I have within the last 7.5 years come out as bisexual and androgynous. So I mean, there are multiple layers to my identity as an odd duck. It isn't exactly easy being this different, so I have to say that it was somewhat difficult navigating adolescence and childhood with all of these overlapping odd duck identities. But I wouldn't change my neurodivergence or my queerness, not even for a second. It's taken a lot of time. It's taken quite a while, actually, for me to come to that personal place of self-acceptance and inner peace, though. I found an incredible sense of community, all of whom I am so far beyond grateful and appreciative of and for. Narrative was my sanctuary in youth, the place I found myself safe. In stories, I could find myself at home. I could step inside the world of a story and not have to worry about ways that I stuck out. A book is a place to belong. I take that as a sacred creed almost. But so much more than mere belonging. For many, a story is a place to thrive, a place to seek and explore, a whole world to step inside and experience. So on an individual, personal level, as we saw in the case of Helen Fagan's clandestine school, story has a power to be a lifeline and a means of maintaining connection with our humanity. And story can be a place of sanctuary and a means of escapism. Some may use that as a pejorative, saying, "Oh, look at the bookish ones who cannot cope with reality and thus seek a safe space in fiction." You will never, not even once, catch me making that argument, though. Stories have legitimate power and influence to captivate a reader, in a space that oftentimes is more exciting than the world around us. How could it possibly be a bad thing to seek refuge in a kinder and more just world, or a more adventurous and daring world, or simply one with a character or setting that holds our intrigue? On a historical level, I have an example from the American Civil War era. The author Harriet Beecher Stowe, often known for writing the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, met with President Lincoln in 1862. As the historical anecdote goes, President Lincoln said upon greeting Stowe, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." To me, that is a testament to the power of story to reshape history. A novel, a work of fiction, was so immensely impactful upon the spread of the cause of abolitionism that the American president would say that. So working under the assumption that a story can start a literal war can also bring about peace. Going back for just a moment to the book Good Omens, a brief pull quote in regard to peace. Sometimes, despite everything, peace breaks out. People get tired of fighting and pain and death and are willing to start all over again. Can story impact this? Can we take a narrative we find written down or told to us and allow it to reshape the way we treat our neighbors or those we regard as other, even our enemies? I certainly hope so. There's a phrase in the queer liberation movement: the first Pride was a riot. This, of course, harkens back to the Stonewall Inn riots of 1969, the spark that ignited the queer liberation movement into a full-on decades-long civil rights struggle. It started as queer folks fighting back against repressive, unjust laws and against police brutality, and now it is a source of hope, solidarity, and queer joy for millions all over the world. And I think the key to the public reception of cultural and historical milestone events like this is in telling the story properly. I'm not talking about journalistic spin, but rather about sharing the facts of the matter in a way that scratches below the surface of the issues, gets to the heart of why struggling people are hurting, and seeks justice and liberation. Because without justice, there truly can be no peace. So for the queer community, I just have to say this: revel in storytelling. Embrace this fully human experience of recounting narratives, sharing experiences. Since time immemorial, we as a species have used story to communicate ideas, to impart wisdom and virtues, to warn about dangers, to entertain and bond with one another, and to truly enjoy and encounter life in a way that seems unique to our human experience. And to all of those who feel that you have a story worth telling, I say this: only you can tell it. Empower yourself with the agency to tell that story. In a more metaphorical sense, you are the author of your own story. Make it awesome. And thank you so much, all of those listening, and to Project Q&A for giving me this space to speak on the power of story. I welcome any and all questions now. I went a little quicker than I intended. My time is far from over, but any questions or comments, I'd love to address them.
Okay. Thank you to everyone that tuned in. Thank you to W.D. Cullum for a beautiful presentation. If you want to learn more about Project Q&A, our work, or Southeast Kansas Pride, visit our website and follow us on social media. To support our work in rural communities, please consider making a tax-deductible donation today. Thank you for watching our Lunch and Learn.